click presentation mode. Can y'all see it okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone who's here, and thank you for our speakers today. What the Wicked Problems Project is at GSU. We have two issues, climate change and housing insecurity. And what we've done is gathered together 8 faculty around each of these issues. And the point here is to have 8 different disciplinary views to have discussions around these topics. And the whole idea of wicked problems we'll talk about in a minute, but it's these issues that we need various disciplinary perspectives to even begin to understand these issues. And so today we're talking about climate change, and we have 4 faculty at this particular event, and we've got some live events coming up next week on the downtown campus and Dunwoody. We have Nadine Kabengi from chemistry, Michael Black from neuroscience, Shannon Finck from English, and Amy Spring from sociology. And thank y'all again for doing all this. And so we have a bunch of short videos where these faculty members, the 8 faculty members around the issue of climate change, answer some questions, and then we package these together, and we've got some course material built around this, and then these events. So just briefly, what are wicked problems? It comes from the world of planning, this term, and it's been around for a while, but it's being used in higher ed more and more. And it's the idea that our students need to be able to work on unstructured problems, things that don't necessarily have answers. So often, traditionally, school is like, here is the information, and now you repeat that information back to me, which doesn't give a chance to students and even models something where it's like, well, there is an expert and they have the answers, as opposed to we have to think these things through, and a lot of people need to be involved in thinking them through, and there aren't clear answers. And so wicked problems are these issues that are extremely complex. There aren't any solutions. If there are solutions, you have to repeat those solutions over and over and over, reimagine them, repeat them again. And it's even difficult to wrap your head around the issue because there's so many issues involved. And so understanding these wicked problems requires a bunch of different disciplines if we're even going to scratch the surface. And that's what we're trying to do here. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I think we've got Nadine up first. So if y'all want to just give me a thumbs up, and I can make the slides go.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be part of this project. I think this is such a timely project. It's such an interesting approach to these problems. I didn't realize that the wicked word is actually means like there's a process behind it, but surely, climate change is one of these wicked problems that is really, really necessary. And so I'm, as Brennan said, I'm in the chemistry department, but I'm also in the geochemistry department. And so I take an approach, really what I'm calling the geochemical perspective. And what I'd like to focus today on is sharing a little bit about the carbon dioxide removal. So if you think about the global warming crisis that we're in, we can just really simply imagine that it will cease really when the planet reaches net zero greenhouse emissions. And so in order to get that net zero greenhouse emissions, we have 2 aspects. We have to achieve deep reductions in the emissions of greenhouse gases. But we also know that now this may not be enough, but that we need to deploy approaches that actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And these might be deployed at much larger scale to keep warming levels below the dangerous levels that we anticipate, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever we reach. And that carbon dioxide removal strategies, the CDR, really needs to be deployed at a significant large scale in order to offset the continued emission sources that, because of physical constraint or social justice standard, they're particularly hard to avoid. What we call really the hard to avoid emissions, agricultural practices, shipping costs, aviation will always have some CO2. And so if we think about the options for CDR, and if you just do next, there are several ways that this active CDR might happen, right? There are, one of them is what we call CO2 mineralization, which is the processes by which, minerals react, and we can take CO2 from the air, actively take CO2 from the air and create new minerals, carbonate rock, for instance. We can enhance the portion of the CO2 that is already absorbed by the ocean, which we call ocean alkalinity enhancement. So changing the charge balance in the ocean, which already takes a big sink of CO2, and then increase that. Another really important component of that CDR is what we call soil carbon sequestration. So the use of land and agricultural practices to increase the storage of CO2. And you can see on the slide, I'm not going to go through each one of them. I'm happy to answer questions later. But, there's also some management strategies that involve reforestation, growing more trees, where places where these may not have been forested before, or basically having biomass energy, where we can remove a little bit of the conversion of the biomass into material with more durable storage. What I do really in my lab, and some of the aspect is really around the soil sequestration, but this direct air CO2 capture, what we call the DAC. And the DAC really is a process that removes CO2 from ambient air and concentrated for storage deep underground, or to be used in a various product. And so and this figure comes from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Math in 2019 in the report. And you can see that both the DAC, the direct air CO2 capture, and the biomass energy are linked really to that reservoir, that geological formation where we want to put the CO2 once we capture it, assuming that we can take CO2 out of the air. So we are actively scrubbing it as well. And so if you just advance next. And so what that means really in terms of processes, I mean, this sounds really easy and fun, but that means we have to remove CO2 from what we call a dilute source. So a place where CO2 does not exist in a concentrated mass. And we have to efficiently capture it and really do three things with it. We have to either produce molecules and materials, and then we either convert the CO2 that we just scrub it, and that molecule, the CO2, it actually is a very interesting molecule, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to durable minerals, and eventually capture it efficiently and safe store it through geological sequestration. And again, what is really key about the CO2 molecule, that is just, you see it's linear. And so it's just basically, it's a carbon atom in the middle with 2 oxygen. It's thermodynamically very stable. And that presents a challenge really. And so if we look at what our community are thinking of in terms of all these different processes, and as I said, all these processes span so many different disciplines. We're talking about oceanic chemistry, we're talking about material chemistry, we're talking about geology, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about many different portfolio of discipline. And that's why the framework that we're sitting in right now, in that interdisciplinary wicked framework, is very important, because it really spans all of it. So if you just go forward one more slide, if I may. So that means that there are many challenges and opportunities that present itself to the community that I'm in. The bigger goal, the larger goal, is really to deploy and to develop an efficient and scalable carbon capture portfolio. And I say the word portfolio because it will be a mixture of these strategies, whether it's DAC that I'm really actively researching, or whether it's going to be a little bit of agriculture and DAC and sequestration, because not all processes will be available and successful around the globe. So there will be a portfolio of these strategies. And so the challenges and opportunities, because there are opportunities of virtual research, of education, of potential development, exist in the material. So if we are thinking of some material that's going to do 2 things, right? 2 things that are very paradoxical. We want a material that efficiently capture CO2. And so it has to be, just to talk chemistry-wise, it has to be thermodynamically favorable. It has to be low energy, but also just turn around and release CO2. It's kind of like we're going to develop a material that really likes sugar and really wants sugar, but at the same time want to give up sugar. I mean, it's a hard concept to think of. So it has to efficiently capture it and turn around and rapidly release it. And the reason why we need to do that is because the sheer quantity of CO2 that we need to remove from the air to keep the degree of warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees is really huge. And so we're thinking of materials that needs to be recycled. And so one of the aspects, one of the general questions that the community is, kind of converging and researching, actively researching, is developing those materials. And so in my lab, for instance, we're looking at copper oxide nanoparticle as potential material for that. And there are communities around the nation, around the globe, looking at, developing and synthesizing materials, whether they're clays material, whether they're, nanoparticles, or on and on, many different materials. So that's one really general area of research and question, if you will, growth and opportunity. The other one really has to do with the method. And I alluded to that earlier, in that the CO2 molecule, as I said, is thermodynamically very favorable. So in order to take it out of the air, we have to be able to bend it in order to just basically create an energy barrier, thermodynamic energy barrier, to remove it from the air. And then once you take it out of the air, and to make it into a mineral, into a material, we have to basically do things to it that are both thermodynamic and kinetically hard. And so the method, the processes, the reactions, the mechanisms that's going to allow us to do those things, from taking it from this dilute source really to a concentrated thing. And this is where a lot of chemistry, a lot of physics, a lot of computational thoughts have gone in, and theoretical thoughts. And the last opportunity and the challenge that I will speak of is really that transport and storage. And that idea is that, one, we need reservoir. I mean, you saw the DAC is the direct air capture is linked to the availability and of a reservoir, geological reservoir, that is suitable for taking this concentrated form of CO2 that at that point is going to be pressured and might be acting like a liquid. So it's going to be 50 to 60% less dense than air, more dense than air. And we're going to, have a reservoir, and that has the availability, the capacity, and the durability. So some of the questions that emerge then is, well, once we do take CO2 and inject it and sequester it, what are the ensuing physical and chemical transformation that might happen? Can we keep it down there? And it's not happening, I just want to be very clear, it's not happening within 1 feet or 2 feet or 3 feet. It's happening within 800 feet, thousands of feet down the ground. So it's not necessarily imminent danger to us as a people living on this planet, but still have to think about the long-term storage. And oftentimes, the places where we need to capture CO2 from may not be in direct proximity to where we need to store them. So then there's logistical challenges and opportunities, where the distances and how do we carry CO2. It's not something that we have not done before, but just think about the larger scale. And on top of all these challenges and those amazing research questions that we're thinking as a community overall, the geochemistry community and the chemical community, has to do with thinking about the cost of all of this. And the cost can be money, monetary, economical, but it can also be resources, and it can be also environmental costs, the impacts and the risks of doing all these, the energy. I mean, if we're trying to save the planet by sequestering CO2, are we going to expend more energy doing all of that? And so just that balance, the life cycle analysis of the energy that is required. And there's a very important component, and that's, again, I go back to that idea that why the other disciplines are needed. There's an environmental and social justice component, where the communities that will potentially have to pay a price might not be the communities that generate all that CO2, or where the DAC systems that might potentially be large scale will be deployed. Maybe perhaps communities that have typically and historically paid much higher prices for these environmental problems. And so there's a really important element to the social justice piece, where we have to think about who's paying the price and who's really offering land, if you will, in order to do all that. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Nadine. And so, yeah, let's maybe see one of these other disciplines, and what might seem very far afield maybe isn't so much. But Shannon, you want to take over and just give me a thumbs up when you want me to move forward.
Great. Hi, am I audible to everyone? Sound good?
Yes.
Okay. So this is maybe going to seem like a sharp turn from what my colleague Nadine was talking about. So I'm just going to kind of start with the facts and then move on to the stories. So the facts on the ground are climate change poses a significant and undeniable series of material challenges to human and non-human thriving. This we know. It also poses some significant philosophical challenges for human beings, especially to the ways that we think about and plan for the future. So human beings in general, like we're really good at reasoning, adapting, innovating, but it turns out we're not terribly good at imagining a future that is not one of two things: a continuation of the present or an utter apocalypse. So you can see this in all kinds of examples of our literature and media. These all bear this out. Especially environmental literature and media tend to be kind of apocalyptic in focus. And when I say this too, I don't just mean fiction, I also mean other nonfiction genres, including the news, tend to be sort of apocalyptic when they talk about climate change or environmental catastrophe. And so the study of literature and the study of climate change intersect here at this point where the stories we tell start to paint a picture of our historical thinking on a particular subject, in this case, environmental crisis, and where they might diverge from this course and help us to think differently. So on to the stories. All right, so scholars of literature have spent the last decade or so looking at precisely this conundrum, the question of whether and how climate writing or Anthropocene genres of writing might help us to envision living on a radically changed planet, and not just surviving it, like actually wanting a life on a radically changed planet, understanding it not as just an attenuated future, but a good and meaningful life. And so I want to kind of begin with Stephanie Le Ménager, who writes in her essay, Climate Change and the Struggle for Genre, about kind of how we think about this. And she's working forward from a couple of assumptions. One, that storytelling is one of the primary modes by which humans work through our difficult or wicked problems, and that we often look to narrative to teach us how to live, whether we know it or not. And you can see this kind of in the first quote. People outside of academia, people who might not be expected to care about genre, are looking hard for Anthropocene genres, for patterns of expectation and narrative form with which to combat this unsettling era of climate shift and social injury. And the other thing Le Ménager's work points out is that when we think about possible climate futures, we are interested in more than mere survival. Just surviving a climate apocalypse is not enough. It's not a good and meaningful life. And so she'll put this as a question of like, will there be love in the era of climate collapse? She writes a lot about whether or not like we'll be able to like experience things like love and joy, or how those human forms of bonding will be changed by a changing planet. And at the very end of that quote on the slide, you'll see she offers the suggestion that the novelistic mode has always offered opportunities for trying out and testing material and social relations. So imagining like radically different ways of being, realistic ones and kind of crazy, fantastic ones. Next slide, please. Okay, so similarly, we have Elizabeth de Loffre's sort of assumptions about the capacity of literature to help us work through this kind of crisis. And de Loffre writes, turning to literature, film, and the arts helps us ask what kinds of narratives help us navigate an ecological crisis that is understood as local and planetary, as historical and anticipatory, so existing on multiple sort of temporal and spatial scales. Questions about narrative and representation are vital to understanding the Anthropocene because, as an epic that reflects a radical break from the past, it poses specific epistemological and ontological challenges. Of course, the Anthropocene is material in that it concerns what can be measured and experienced, and it is representational in that it raises vital questions as to how the planet can be, as a system can be signified. And so here she's thinking through like not only the material prospects of planetary change, but also the representational prospects. In other words, like what does life on a radically changed planet demand that we revise about our notions of a viable, or to use a buzzword, sustainable series of social and economic systems. A changing planet is obviously going to have to change things that we take as sort of given functional systems, i.e. capitalism being one of them. And so, next slide, please. The easiest way to kind of approach these unknowns is to revert to a very rudimentary form of storytelling, the allegory. And de Loffre will put this two ways. allegory has grown more prevalent in environmental writing as the climate crisis grows nearer and more dire, because allegories tend to paint the world in extremes so that we can find the nuance that lies in between the extremes that we see in allegory. And allegories are always pedagogical tools. They teach us how to think on multiple temporal scales, and they help us expand our sense of the temporal. So they purport to address everyone everywhere across space and time. And of course, this is a provisional fiction. No story can ever actually do that. But the fact that we know that that's not possible helps us to kind of feel for the nuances in between. And these stories also remind us of the kind of through lines that connect us to historically and geographically different moments. Next slide, please. Okay, so in what time I have left, I would like to demonstrate kind of how my own work on literary texts engages these scholars' ideas by sharing a little excerpt from a new project. Brennan, how much time?
Uh, I mean, you can take
Good.
a couple more minutes, several more minutes, whatever you need.
Okay, I'm just going to read you a quick excerpt of this project that I'm working on. So, in her collection of essays on drowned, Alexis Pauline Gumbs invents a meditative strategy she identifies as marine mammal apprenticeship, a contemplative practice of drawing largely on the metaphorics of whale and dolphin behavior in order to illustrate the ways sea life can help us navigate the sea change, both literal and figurative, of an impending climate crisis. Our marine mammal kin, Gumbs writes, are amazing at not drowning. Therefore, they have much to teach us about vulnerability, collaboration, and adaptation as the ocean rises and coastlines shrink, and we contemplate our own species' survival in a drowned world. So Gumbs' interest in the context of undrowning is both historical and speculative. On the one hand, it reflects an effort to locate the self in a shifting relation to existing stories, constructs, systems, and ecosystems, in which we are misled to believe that it is possible only to sink or swim. So in other words, on the other hand, it offers an emergent strategy for learning to transcend the treading of water, waiting to be held or held down. So likewise, I'm reading this series of essays with a story, The Gondoliers, from Karen Russell's Orange World. This is a 2019 collection of short stories, and they're mostly about climate crisis. And so The Gondoliers takes place in the flooded byways of submerged Miami, which is known as Bahia del Oro, or Bay of Gold, to its undrowned residents, who are described as illegal holdouts of a hasty and permanent evacuation. So the story is narrated by Janelle Picaro, who is the youngest of 4 orphan sisters, and they make their living in this sunken underworld as ferry women, gondoliers navigating the inundated city, sounding its depths through echolocation. We don't know how they can do this, but toxic waste is maybe responsible. And so it follows Janelle on a kind of journey to what is called the dead spot, which is a place where the sisters can't echolocate and they can't find their way. I'm not gonna tell you what happens in this story, but I will tell you that it involves interspecies communication at the end. As Gumbs writes, we can cultivate practices for finding one another in a shifting world. And so reading Russell's story through Gumbs's framework of undrowning reveals it to be an Anthropocene allegory, wherein effective divisions between human and other mammalian life erode as they prove less and less helpful to the collective survival of life on a changed planet. And I'm happy to talk more about this project in the question and answer session, but that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's see, who do we have next? Amy.
Hello, can everybody hear me? All right, so I am Amy Spring. I'm Associate Professor in Sociology at the downtown Atlanta campus. I've been at GSU for going on 9 years, and I would like to thank my colleagues for their presentations. They've provided some wonderful information that I learned a lot from, and so I'm happy to be here to provide the sociological perspective. We can go to the next slide. So within my field of sociology, I am part of a subfield known as demography, which is just really a fancy word for population studies. So demographers are interested in population change. And of course, population change has a lot of relevance for thinking about climate change, because one of the drivers of climate change has been very rapid growth in the world's population over the last century. So you can see this kind of, it's small on the graph to the left, but you can get a sense of basically how quickly the population has grown as of late. From demographers, we know it actually took all of human history up until about the year 1800 to reach the first 1 billion people on Earth. And now we are adding 1 billion people about every 12 years. So the population growth has accelerated, and we're up to 8 billion people now. And so when my colleague was talking about apocalyptic scenarios, you know, the graph on the left of the population growth is something that has definitely been framed in a apocalyptic, that's a hard word, apocalyptic narrative. But the good news is that we also know that population growth is not going to continue at this rate. And in fact, demographers predict that the world will kind of tap out at around 11 billion people. So we need to think about how we are going to live on this earth with 11 billion or so people coming in the next 50 years or so. I should also get into how way more important than thinking about the sheer number of people is thinking about the way that people are living and how these 11 billion people are distributing resources and which populations are contributing what we could call more than their fair share of carbon emissions and which populations are contributing less. And so this is where the sociology really comes in. Sociologists are very interested in social structures. And so a sociologist would ask, what are the social structures that have created the problem of climate change? So here I'm looking at the graph on the right and taking an example from this graph. A sociologist might ask a question like, what aspects of patriarchy have contributed to environmental problems? So for example, they might ask, you know, how have women been systematically left out of making policy decisions that have affected climate change? So in other words, a sociologist seeks to understand climate change as a social crisis, and we understand it as a crisis that is human-made. A sociologist is also very interested in inequality and injustice. So a sociologist would also ask, you know, of these systems that I have on this graph, kind of who is benefiting from these systems and who is being harmed by them. So they would focus how the harms associated with climate change are not equally distributed across society, but they actually fall more on certain groups. And so we would look by race, class, gender, region of the world, citizenship status, and sociologists would note how this power imbalance can create the problem, but can also impede solutions to the problem. Because the people who are most often the most harmed by climate change are not historically the people who have had places of decision-making power. So we can go to the next slide. So because sociologists understand climate change as a social crisis, we of course are then focused on social solutions. And so social solutions are very hard to achieve because now we are talking about sort of making fundamental social changes to the way that our society is structured and the way that it operates. So that's a really big task. That's asking a lot. That will take a lot of time and effort because we're talking about achieving fundamental social change through things like social movements, through cultural transformations, through transforming our institutions, and also to thinking about all of this in an intersectional lens. So that means taking into account race, class, gender, and all of the ways that those things intersect. So obviously, fundamental social change is asking a lot and will take a lot of time and effort. And a sociologist would be very skeptical of any sort of kind of quick fix solution or purely technological solution. You know, we need those technologies, but without thinking about kind of the social change that goes along with it, a sociologist would worry that we are going to just replicate the same problem over and over again. So going back to my example about how women have been left out of decision making, a sociologist would be really interested in how women's voices are being included in the environmental movement. And so we'd be skeptical of even the environmental movement itself. And in fact, I recently read a report that said something like 80% of the CEOs and executive directors of environmental nonprofits are white men. And so a sociologist would say that we need to find a way to include more diverse voices in the environmental movement if we are going to reach real solutions that last. And so this is where an environmental justice framework also comes in. This framework would stress that the people who are being the most harmed by climate change and environmental problems would be the most important voices in terms of finding a solution. We can go to the next slide. So my research and teaching mostly surrounds what I call contextual neighborhood effects. And so what this means is, as a sociologist, my research mostly focuses on where we live and how our residential environments influence our health and well-being, and then how social inequalities come into that. So one of the classes that is probably most relevant to this group is we do have a class that I teach called Environmental Sociology. And here we are focused on topics like the social construction of nature, just kind of how do we decide kind of what is nature and what does that mean? We talk about disaster vulnerability and not just at the individual level, but also thinking about it at the community level, environmental justice and environmental movements, climate denial, and then race, imperialism, and capitalism as systematic causes of environmental problems. And then on the other side, my research. So one of the newer projects that I'm just starting, so I don't have findings to share yet, but I'm a residential mobility scholar. I'm interested in how people experience the places that they live and also how they choose to move and where they choose to move to. And so I want to start this new project on US internal migration and residential mobility in response to environmental disruptions. So there's already a lot of good research to show that when people experience an environmental disaster, even on an individual level, but also maybe just in their community, even if they weren't as directly affected, it can still create all kinds of residential instability. So people become very likely to need to move. Perhaps their housing becomes unstable, and so they move around within that community, or people may move out altogether and move to a different part of the country. And so there is this term environmental migration. And so that's something I want to explore in more detail and think about kind of who moves, who stays, and how those social statuses and identities that I talked about influence those residential decisions. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close this down and let Michael give his disciplinary take. So here we go, and Michael, take it away. You're muted.
Thank you, Brennan, and thanks to all my colleagues. I'm a principal lecturer in the Neuroscience Institute, and so I'm going to be talking about how what we understand about the brain can lead us to some conclusions on how we deal with the climate crisis, and how we perceive the climate crisis, and how we adapt to the climate crisis. There are a lot of new studies coming out looking at what the neural pathways and brain regions are involved in decision making and how things affect what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, and how that changes how we respond. And our perceptions of threats very much influence our actions. as Dr. Finck was talking about earlier, the apocalyptic kind of perception leads our brains to go into a fight or flight, such that our brains are responding to threat. They either shut down or they look to get away from wherever that is. And as Dr. Spring was pointing out, there's a lot of collective action that needs to take place. And if the threat is perceived and an individual is experiencing that threat, then the individual is less likely to take action because the responsibility is dispersed across a large number of people. And so this is a major challenge in addressing climate change, because a big piece of this, as Dr. Kabengi was saying, is that we need to decrease our carbon emissions, and that is going to be particularly important in our behavior change. We can pull back a lot of carbon, but we can't pull back as much as we're producing. And so we need to make sure that we're decreasing the amount that we're producing, and in addition, being able to pull some back. And in order to do those kinds of things, we need to look at what's happening in the brain and understand what are the pathways that play a role in this. And one of the things that we've learned so far is that you're much more likely to take action if there is hope, if there is something that you can do that makes a difference in that process. And this is what Dr. Finck was talking about within the literature. There's a lot of news about all of the bad things that are going to happen with climate change, but that tends to shut people down. We know some of the solutions that we need, and we know what we need to do with those solutions. And neuroscience has already found, along with some psychological work, that when people see somebody acting, they're more likely to act themselves. We're very social creatures as human beings. And so in doing work, you can affect other people to do similar work. And one of the big things that makes a big difference in, say, whether somebody decides to put solar energy on their homes and their solar panels on their homes, one of the biggest factors that affects whether they do or not is if their neighbor has done so. And if their neighbor has put solar panels on their house, they are more likely to do the same. And because of that, we know that when we take action at individual levels, we can affect more societal change. And when we don't take action, we also are affecting societal change, but in the reverse, making people less likely to actually respond and do the types of things that they might need to do. So my work is quite practical. I tend to be out in the world trying to affect change in terms of reducing the climate impacts. And so some of the things that I've been involved with at Georgia State is helping to form a Sustainability Initiatives Office that can assess and address some of our carbon emissions at Georgia State University. And recently, this past summer, they just received a $22 million grant to convert our whole bus fleet to electric. So this has multiple different types of benefits, not just that we're using less gasoline for carbon emissions, but also the pollution effects and the air quality effects in the downtown area are dramatically affected by that. I also, in the city of Decatur, was very involved in making sure we had a solarized program. Knowing that neighbors affect neighbors, we got the community together with Decatur, city of Decatur, and DeKalb County to say the more people who buy in, the cheaper the solar panels will be, and the more of us will have a collective impact on this. And the Solarized campaign was one of the most successful in the state of Georgia. At the time, it was the most successful in the state of Georgia for capacity, almost a gigawatt of solar, or almost a megawatt of solar, sorry, a megawatt of solar. I'm expanding it out. But very much what was found during that process was when one house would add solar, houses nearby, the neighbors, would see that and be more likely to put solar on their own homes. The neuroscience principles that are involved in this are still not well understood. We still have a lot to understand about how those pathways work and what kinds of things those pathways involve. And so in my teaching, I teach an honors class in urban sustainability. We talk about some of these issues. And in my neuroscience teaching in scientific method and neuroscience, we talk about how we influence each other in terms of the behaviors that we have, and then how we evaluate scientific claims and read and write scientifically to understand some of these pathways. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you, Michael, for kind of tying in to everyone, and that's exactly what I'm hoping we can do. Now everyone's spoken for a minute and spoken for a minute, is that a right term? So I'm hoping we have some questions from the audience. I'm very new to the webinar feature on WebEx, so I think people can raise their hands if they have a question, and I can unmute them or ask them if they want to unmute, or people can put something in the chat. So I'll be looking for those, but as y'all are thinking of questions, let me go ahead and ask a first one. Can everyone give, and Michael, you just did give one Atlanta example, but can everyone give an example of something that you see in a way that Atlanta is affected by this issue, or that Atlanta is doing something interesting, connected to combating climate change? Okay, yeah.
I guess I can go first. Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Immediately, I was just thinking about what Atlanta is doing with the Beltline. Of course, that's a major project happening in Atlanta. And one of the big goals from the outside of the Beltline was, of course, to be creating some sustainable transit options. But one thing that, a sociologist would think about is whether that is coming to fruition. So there's also a lot of gentrification that's happening around the Beltline. And so something that scholars are talking about is, the concept of green gentrification, where sort of sustainability or environmental concerns are used as sort of a way to achieve other goals as well, such as higher property values and upgrading of the neighborhood, and that can push traditional residents or residents who have been there a long time out. Something I just saw in the news regarding this issue is that there's a plan to have light rail alongside the Beltline Trail, and I didn't realize, and that's been part of the plan from the beginning. It just hasn't been built yet, but I just read that there are some groups that are opposing that light rail, worrying that it's going to make the Beltline a less, pleasant kind of park, because that's what it is right now, is just a really big park with, transportation built in. But anyway, residents are worried about how adding that light rail option will kind of disrupt what the Beltline has become. And so that's an example of where some of the environmental goals are then at odds with some other things that people are trying to achieve. And so we have to keep our eye on issues like green gentrification. But I was also happy to see that I don't think that group is succeeding in terms of getting the light rail removed from the plan. I don't think they're succeeding.
Well, and that's interesting in how many ways the two wicked problems that unintentionally it was like, okay, we have housing issues and we have like that there's so much connection, because so much of zoning and the way things work, it's the people who have the means to live somewhere then make it impossible for other people to move in or use the space, even if it was intended the whole way and the infrastructure was built for other things. Suddenly, the very few people who can live in that space then dominate it and prevent other uses. And yeah, yeah. Other examples.
I think a lot about the expansion of the MARTA, and I have like two pieces in my brain at all time, right? I mean, as a scientist, as a chemist and a geochemist, I realized that what is really needed is large scale deployment of processes, right? And so we do realize that, you know, the million of the car on the road, even if we did remove them, might be offset by just putting one. I'm going to give an example of a factory that is in Georgia, or there's like a paper mill or something that basically is generating a lot of contamination and air pollution. And so, but to Dr. Dr. Black point, that I think the expansion of the MARTA and focusing on that is an avenue of people getting educated and get a buy-in into a cause that is just very important, even though the impact may not be as large scale as we wanted, kind of in terms of removal of CO2. But then that potentially might be an example for folks to just get, you know, just more sustainable advocacy, get really changes, and then impacting change on a larger scale. And so I don't know if we will ever expand MARTA, or if we'll expand MARTA in ways that are meaningful enough so people can get on it and then remove some of the cars on the roads. But that's one thing I follow very carefully.
Right, right. And I'm looking for raised hands in the audience or chat questions. So please, please don't let it be me who's asking all the questions.
And then while we're waiting, can I drop something into the question about what's happening in Atlanta?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is obviously a politically fraught topic, but when we think about carbon emissions in Atlanta in particular, I think we almost always immediately go to cars and transit. But if you also think about the Cop City project, which is now getting like national attention, and what those activists are doing out there to protect urban forests, which are like incredibly important when we're like thinking holistically about this climate question, like that's not insignificant work to address the climate crisis.
Yeah, and that's not what you hear about in the news. It's the more criminal justice aspect of it, and while it's kind of in the background, yeah, maybe that part of the issue needs to be foregrounded more. Of like we're talking about this huge forest in the city and how important forests are, and Atlanta's kind of reputation or reality of being, you know, the city in the forest, that we have more trees than I think any other city, you know, per whatever acre, however they would measure it. And so, yeah, that yeah, is a great example that maybe we need to pay more attention to when we're talking about that particular very hot button political issue. All right. So do y'all have questions for one another? I've got lots of questions. I would love
There's
to
a hand in
We
the
do have a question from
chat.
Kyle and Tamra.
Okay. Oh, I'm just not seeing it then. Okay, so we've got a chat here. Okay, here we go. Trying to make my chat big enough where I can read it.
Oh, wait, maybe it's just a raised hand. It's not actually in the chat.
Okay. Oh, no, we've got something. So Catherine Cruz, we've got, would mental health be a considerable concern with climate change rising?
Yes, this is something I didn't talk as much about, but mental anxiety over climate change is on the rise, particularly among young people. And so it's a major mental health concern, that's gaining more and more prominence. And lots of people are looking at how things are perceived and how we should help people to cope, and what are the coping strategies to deal with some of those mental anxieties around the climate crisis.
And I know many of my friends who are most concerned like they go back and forth between like wanting to do something and just shutting down totally. And similar to, I think, some of the ideas that Shannon brought up, that's not going to help out, even though you might be the most concerned about it. But if that's what happens to us, understandably, that we shut down.
Yeah, well, and I think too, like the role of stories, at least like the ones that aren't apocalyptic in nature, which we're kind of seeing more and more of, is like to get us in a more creative headspace when we think about climate change, like we're obviously not going to be able to like sing with the whales, but that's a pleasurable thing to imagine, a future that is so radically different that that's something human beings could do. And while we know that that's like a fantasy, we know that that's a work of science fiction, um, I think that it helps us kind of bridge the space of what we think is possible. And, like we're not quite as limited if we can kind of imagine these like more radical futures that are not possible, then we're more creative when we imagine the ones that are. That gets us maybe out of climate despair or anxiety a little bit.
Does anyone else want to speak to that? And if not, I'll open it up to Kyle. Okay, so Kyle, I am going to request an unmute. Oh, Kyle, there we go. Hey, Kyle, do you have a question?
I do have a question. I want to make sure y'all can hear me though. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yep.
All right, most definitely. So I'm not sure which professor it was speaking about green gentrification, but can you speak on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I think I was the one who originally brought that up. And so green gentrification is just the idea of improvements in the built environment, so housing, but also we could think of other aspects of neighborhood built environments like better sidewalks or bike lanes or things like that, that are made with sort of the goal of sustainability or the goal of being more environmentally sustainable. But sometimes those are the same things that can also drive up property values in that same neighborhood if there are no regulations. And so sometimes even those things can be sometimes there can be ulterior motives even, right, to putting some of those things in place where people know kind of what they're doing when they're doing green gentrification. So I'm not sure if it's malicious or not, but I do think that we see that when improvements like that are made to either housing or neighborhoods, it also often drives up property values, which can end up pushing people out of the neighborhood who were there before. And so, it's not that we can't imagine a solution to that. We can imagine a solution to that, and that would be regulations. And so then we could talk about lowering property taxes for people who have lived there for a long time or older people in the neighborhood. We could talk about requirements for affordable housing before, a new building can be built. Maybe the developer needs to show how many affordable housing units they're going to incorporate. We could talk about, limits to rent. Rent control is something that was common at one point in some cities and has largely gone away. So there are potential regulations that we could enact where we can have great neighborhoods that are environmentally sustainable, but also we can maintain our affordable housing.
Well, and like I think we can probably think of examples in our own lives that have to do with this. Like I bike to work. I can bike to work because I can afford to live near work, right? And so for me to look at my students or something saying, why aren't you, biking to work or biking to school, or when there's no way that they could afford living in the neighborhood that I happen to live in that allows me to do that, is kind of preposterous. That doesn't mean I'm doing the wrong thing by biking. It's a good thing, great, but it's not a feasible thing. And we need to figure out, I think, like Amy's saying, what are the ways that more people can do those things? Because often it just looks like, oh, people with means can put solar on the roof. and how do we change that? And just one quick example, because this is part of what motivated me both with the housing and the climate change issues, is hearing on NPR years ago, there was an elderly woman living in a historically African-American neighborhood. And she was being interviewed about the cleanup that was happening with Proctor Creek. And so this positive environmental thing, like this very toxic creek, so many of Atlanta's waterways are just toxic, and it was being cleaned up. And you had this elderly resident saying, I don't want them to clean it up, because when they clean it up, they're going to make me leave. And so it wasn't that that person didn't understand the dangers or the problems with that. It was that her life was going to be so disrupted by the greening of this creek that it wasn't worth it. And so if we live in a society where people are having to make those decisions, and I think that goes to a lot of what Amy was saying with, like, okay, the various isms that are affecting this. So yeah. So anyone else want to comment on the
Yeah, if I may, I just want to
greenification?
add one more, maybe a larger global setting as well, right? I think it's the same thing can occur at a global setting as well, when countries with the best intentions, and these are rich countries, global north countries, focusing on technologies or social infrastructural processes to clean up climate change. You know, there are many other global south countries that are going to pay the price in indirect ways, very similar to this woman, where maybe it would have a negative impact on their on their being, without being a major contributor to the climate change issue as well. So there's that aspect of the global situation.
I just
Right.
want to jump in here. Oh, sorry. I didn't
No,
mean to
no,
interrupt
you
you,
go.
Brennan.
You go.
I think this is a good time to pull in this comment from the chat from David Scott about redirecting funding from space and other planets and putting those funds toward this cause, which admire you for just coming for Elon like this. But I also think, like, yeah, how about we not just do settler colonialism in space? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, let me get David's hand's raised, so we can let him comment a little bit more on that, and then we'll move to Tamara after that. So, David, I am going to click the request to unmute.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the whole time I'm thinking about this, all I can think of is that old movie I watched with my kids, Wall-E. And I'm thinking, you know what? This is where this world is going, and it is not a pretty sight to see. And a company I work for, I tried to personally take it on myself to try and get the company management to restructure how they recycled material instead of throwing stuff in the waste. I mean, the sheer amount of waste that this one company produced every day. We had waste management coming and pulling 2 roll-off containers every day. And this is just one company. And I'm thinking, and this is going on worldwide, and I'm like, this is not a good thing. And the stuff that they throw away is absolutely, we can turn around and recycle it and reuse the material, or find other avenues to other companies that may be able to recycle the plastics and stuff that we're throwing away. You know, it was ridiculous. It's like, we had companies that would be willing to take the material for free and come pick it up. They would supply trucks to come pick the stuff up, and all we had to do is call them. But yet it was just laziness. And so, yeah, if there is a way to redirect some of this, it's sickening, because I see that movie Wall-E taking place quick. So
Yeah.
that was just my thought.
Thanks, David. And anyone want to speak to that?
Well, I'm really glad you brought up Wall-E. I sometimes in the past have taught that film, and I always like to ask my students to imagine that it just concludes with the part where the robots are dancing in space. And that forces us to imagine that, like, humans didn't get a second chance. which I think would be maybe a better film.
Anyone else want to speak to David's comments about recycling? And because yeah, it can be overwhelming just at a personal level, like like just seeing like how much trash you're putting out there. And yeah. So well, let's open it up to Tamara. I'm going to click the request on mute.
Wonderful presentation. I'm a faculty member at Perimeter College in political science. As far as recycling goes, I think sometimes people find there's little niches where you can recycle for charity groups, whether it's collecting cans or for a while I was collecting back when we had them, the individual little printer cartridges on my campuses and giving them to a charity group that for kitty cats that use those to collect to raise money. So sometimes it's, you know, if you try to take on something as large as David Scott, it's overwhelming. But if you take a piece and downsize what you're trying to do, and you can really accomplish something important. I just want to say, Michael, weren't you my connection to the Emory University Sustainability Institute? It's been a few years, but I just want to ask if you were involved with that.
Yes.
Yes, I thought so.
So Emory had the Piedmont Project, which was incorporating sustainability into curricula of different classes, and that was me. Yep. That
Okay.
connected us.
I thought so. So we have this connection because I was just going to talk about the class that I developed out of that experience because Michael was able to fund me to go to that institute. And then from that came this perspectives course that I'm teaching now that's called The Sacred Earth. And it has to do with looking at the planet, nature, and animals from ethical and faith-based vantage points and looking at globally. So students aren't just looking at their own faith-based tradition, although we do cover the big religions, but we're looking at all kinds of interesting, from how the Hawaiians look at the earth to how the Buddhists look at the earth, and all sort of all over the planet. And then we have non-religious, non-faith-based traditions. And it's funny because you guys were talking about women earlier. This week, my students are doing ecofeminism as an idea. But I think sometimes when you all talked a little bit today about how students can just kind of give up, or all of us can kind of give up because it's such an overwhelming problem or set of problems. I think with this course, it seems to work out well that if you tap into what people's personal faith or ethical vantage points are and get to that and say, and then have folks kind of then students in particular sort of explore, reflect on what their responsibilities are based on their ethical personal framework. I think that's a way to engage and activate activism, because that's part of the end of the course is sort of an activation kind of exercise. And so I think sometimes that idea is overlooked to motivate folks to take this on from one ethical viewpoint or another. And there's certainly lots of faith-based traditions and ethical groups that have the earth and the planet and sustainability as part of their mantra. So, and the textbook I use is for, if you're interested, is called This Sacred Earth. And so if anyone's interested, let me know, because it's all primary sources. So they're reading Hindu primary sources or Buddhist primary sources or whatever, but little clips, not to overwhelm. It's a second year course, but it seems to be. So they're mining all the time in there, looking for nuggets of gold. So I just wanted to share that idea with you all.
Thanks, Tamara. And I think I'm wondering, I'm guessing everyone here, at least to some degree, teaches something connected to climate change. and I know we typically do that based on our own disciplines, but wondering like, do you bring in other disciplines intentionally? Like Nadine, do you have them read one of these short stories that Stephanie's talking about, or could you?
Yeah.
Or Amy, can you bring in some neuroscience into your class? Or Michael, come talk in your lit class, Shannon. Anyone do it? Let's do it.
I think I was gonna say, let's do it. I mean, certainly we don't do it much. We just focus all our time on the chemistry and their mechanism, their action, and we do acknowledge, and more so lately and recently, that there is a need for an input from the for the sociologists and for the folks that looks at the brain and then the mental health and the stories and all that. But I don't know to what extent it's more than just just like performative talk and the folks being invited. I haven't seen it really being deployed at large scale, and I think there certainly could happen.
With the Wicked Problems video
Absolutely.
series.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah. I was just thinking
I
a
would
lot of
love
what
that.
Dr. Spring was saying. Probably everything that you mentioned, I could, is probably an element to things that I engage in terms of contaminations, in terms of, sort of women, in terms of gender, in terms of everything else. And then the way we even frame, the story of climate change in order to make these technologies, go back to Dr. Finck, and, again, we make it look like the whole world's going to be impacted equally, and that we just have a vested interest in making these CDRs and DAC technologies, and we imagine placing these and deploying these systems in other places on Earth without really any impact on the communities that they're going to get impacted. And then we don't necessarily engage much with neuroscientists like Dr. Black, who might think about the societal and habitual habits and rituals of people that needs to make those changes. And so we just say, let's make these technologies make money, and then we know who we are. I mean, it's basically a subset of nations that are gonna colonize those technologies and make money out of it when they actually end up happening.
Right. Well, and I know we're past time, and I know people might have meetings and stuff coming up. So, certainly drop out when you want. I'm fine with continuing to talk for a little bit, but once again, I understand that people need to head out. So, so I can talk. We've got a question saying, can you explain how the two wicked problems are interconnected? So maybe I'll talk for a second about that. Once again, people feel free to drop out, because I know we had an hour planned and everyone's already stayed over.
But I do want to say thank you before you answer. I would want to say thank you. It was so lovely hearing all these different perspectives and seeing the students, and definitely learning about Sacred Earth was actually very interesting. So thank you for sharing, and I look forward to our next event. And I do have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Nadine. So, the wicked problems weren't intentionally connected. So we said we're going to do this project. We got a committee together to say what are the wicked problems that would make sense for this trial run, because we're hoping we can do some versions of this in the future of these same topics, but then maybe add on other topics. And so the topics we came up with were climate change, probably because that was the obvious one that so many people could speak to, and then housing, because it was something that so clearly affected students at GSU, as well as Atlanta, because Atlanta is kind of the center of some pretty nasty things going on with housing, particularly the buying up of all the single family properties by corporations, particularly in the south and southwest of the city. So we weren't intentionally bringing those topics together, but I think there are so many things that do come together with them. The Proctor Creek example that I was talking about before, and many of the examples that Amy's talking about, it's that is the nature of wicked problems, that they're probably all connected in some way. And that's part of the point, that's what makes them so messy, is that when you do one thing, it affects another thing, or it affects another 1,000 things. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not talking to others, different communities, different disciplines, you have no idea what effects down the road are going to happen. That shouldn't make us not do things, but it should make us be a lot more careful. So, let's see. Anyone else have any comments? Otherwise, we'll kind of head out, and we've got a couple of live events coming up next week. So if you're downtown, we have those coming up on the 18th, I think, and one on the 19th. But I love hearing from the different faculty members. It's been exciting. Shannon, Michael, Amy, anything you want to say before we head out?
No, I just want to say those were really excellent questions, and I want to thank the attendees for being here and listening to us jibber jabber, but also for your input and your questions. That was a really productive discussion, I felt like.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this, and I'll see some or all of you next week. So, great to see you, and look forward to next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.